My spookiest call out was during a night shift. An emergency call was placed on the far west side of town, an industrial area with many abandoned houses. Few people around because nobody wants to live near a landfill. Not many calls from the suburbs, but there are people who squat in some remaining houses. The urban decay opens the door for squatters and drug addicts. The call was placed for a suspected drug overdose. We reached the location and it's clearly an abandoned house. All the windows are broken. There are weeds up to my waist in front of the yard. No street lights and the street is empty. So the night is pitch black and we have to use our flashlights. The whole place is eerie from top to bottom. The door's wide open and we're calling out that assistance has arrived. The house itself is dead silent and my partner takes just a couple of steps into the premises. At this point, we're deciding if we should contact the local PD and stage for them to clear the place before we go any further. The place is mostly empty, but what is there is turned upside down, and some of it scorched from an apparent fire. There's graffiti and garbage everywhere. Directly in front of my partner, "Time to look behind you," is spray painted across the walls of what remained of the living room. On the other side of the front door it said, "Follow me upstairs." It was like one of those message games kids used to scribble in textbooks. I can't help but shine my flashlight up the stairwell, which also illuminates a bedroom wall. The door had been kicked off the hinges, so I had a perfect view of the interior. It said, "Showtime," painted all over the spot a bed might go. We exited and returned to the vehicle. The house was searched and it was completely empty, save for a handful of rats. I'm sure it was just graffiti by kids who thought they were funny, but it definitely wasn't funny at 2 a.m. The strangest part was the call itself. Who rang it in and why? To lure us out there? We waited for law enforcement for any other calls on that side of the town after that night. When I was a newer EMT, my first 911 job was in a mid-sized East Coast city known for its rampant drugs, prostitution, and gang violence. It was a dump, just to put it nicely. At least half of the population lived in horrific Section 8 housing towers that looked like something out of the apocalypse. Abject human misery. One time, we got a call out to the 8th floor of one of those towers by a concerned resident who hadn't seen his elderly neighbor in a few days. So we decided to do a welfare check. Sure enough, when we got to the door, that all too familiar dead person smell was lingering, so we called for a door pop. The chain lock was still engaged, which we had to cut to enter. The whole thing was routine, but for some reason, I was on edge. We get in and the place is ransacked. It looked like the resident had come home from the grocery store and had been attacked while she made her way in. A trail of groceries, coins, smudged blood, and clothes led from the door to the bedroom, as if there'd been a struggle. It looked violent, but we could see her body, and she was tiny. It made me think whoever the assailant was could be a woman or maybe close to her size. That'd be the only way it could have been a fair fight. The old lady is in her bedroom, dead, completely naked, lying on her back in a pool of dried blood, hands raised to cover her face. Her head was turned to the side, and the backside was totally smashed in. One wrist was clearly broken, and a trail of blood led into the bathroom and then back out again. Seeing her in the state of undressed panic and in a defensive position, there's no doubt this was an attack. All of this was incredibly suspicious. There was no way this old woman moved an inch after whatever happened to her happened. All of the evidence pointed to movement from room to room. It was now considered a crime scene. We had to sit there and babysit the apartment until cops showed up a cool 45 minutes later. We explained that it looked suspicious, but Officer Doolittle can't be bothered. He points out that there's no balcony or open windows, and that the chain lock had been engaged when we got there. Who would go after an impoverished old lady with no living relatives anyway, and who locked the door? I argue it's possible to have done from the outside with some creativity dexterity. but he refused to entertain it and dismissed us from the scene. After all, when the chain was still engaged, I could barely get my thin lady wrist into the door crack to try and remove it, but that was the reality. I barely managed, but I could fit my wrist through the door and fumble with the lock. This reinforced my idea that a woman had come in here and committed the crime, someone smaller or younger. As we're leaving the premises, we hear him call it into dispatch as a non-suspicious death on the radio. What the hell happened, I do not know, but it bothers me to this day. I've seen a lot of crime scenes, and that one was one of the most obvious. I used to work as a wilderness guide for troubled teens out in the deserts of Utah. Our shifts were 8 on and 6 days off. So we would be with these teenagers for 8 straight days before our replacements would come. This required a unique skill set in regards to the job. They didn't just need hikers and guides, but counselors and motivational coaches. It was late May, and the high deserts of Utah have really crazy weather systems. The pressure builds up and creates its own weird patterns. We had a freak snowstorm roll in on us and we were holed in, not able to leave our campsite for a few days until the weather broke. I was the only male guide working with the girls group that week, so I slept next door at the edge of the tent, away from everyone else, trying to keep things appropriate. This was also for a vague sense of security for the whole team. I had a really hard time sleeping in those nights of the storm, due to the fact that I was laying in an ice-cold puddle half the time, due to a rip in the tent flooring. So I spent a lot of time keeping my body moving to help offset hypothermia. During the middle of the night, I was laying in my damp, partially frozen sleeping bag, freezing my ass off wondering if this was all worth it, when I hear footsteps, slowly crunching closer toward our tent. I didn't say anything because I figured it was one of the staff coming back from the bathroom, who would maybe slip past me when I dozed off. What was troubling was the nature of the stride. It sounded like they were trying to be quiet. Not polite quiet, as tent mates usually are, but predatory. It was taking silent, calculated steps. The footsteps reached the tent, and I look up to see a guy standing at the entrance. He hadn't realized that I was awake, and was just staring right past me at all of the girls who were asleep. He stood there for what felt like a good 5 minutes, staring at each of the girls with this glazed look in his eyes. I lay still, trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. This was my first month on the job. The man took a step forward, into our tent, when I finally jumped out of my sleeping bag, which is not an easy thing to do, and let out a scream so loud that I scared myself. The guy immediately dove out of our tent and took off running. I chased him until he was out of sight, then returned back to camp. The first thing I did was inform the others of the situation. One of the other hiking guides had actually been partially awake and heard the footsteps themselves. We come up with the only plan we can think of, and immediately got out the satellite phone. We called our boss, who informed the police, and they sent out some trucks to pick us all up and move us to a different part of the desert. They never found that guy, and I have no idea what his intentions were. But I could tell by the way he was looking at those girls that nothing good was going to come of it, if he got any further into that tent. I never slept easy out in the desert after that, which is a shame because it's such a peaceful and beautiful place. One of the few that's truly quiet. I've always kind of thought the quietness might have saved us that night. For context, this was the same time and area that Josh Powell allegedly murdered and disposed of his wife. I was a volunteer for the Coast Guard throughout my time in college. The auxiliary programs really didn't let us do anything cool, but it counted as a credit, experience, and looked good on the resume. We had pretty general duties. One weekend, I was lucky enough to be in a comm room, where we got to handle phones and take calls. It's late afternoon, and we get a ring on shore that there's a ship in distress. Boaters are reporting a general location and some weird behavior. The ship is doing circles and moving into deeper water. At this point, I'm taken off the calls, but I'm allowed to hang out in the room. No one is freaking out yet. but the energy is very serious. No easy smiles, no silly jokes. It was all business until they could figure out exactly what the situation was. They dispatch a helicopter to get eyes on it before they get anything into the water. After 20 or 30 minutes, it spots a cabin cruiser a distance out at sea. It's looping in circles and drifting, holding a maximum of 3 knots. Now it starts to get eerie. The pilot confirms the earlier reports of there being 0 people on board. The helicopter begins fanning out in search of the crew members that had gotten tossed overboard. Command now dispatches an FRC, which is a fast response cutter, or what I called gunner yachts. They were about the same size as a yacht, fast as hell, and outfitted with all kinds of cool rescue equipment. The FRC arrives and does its best to saddle up alongside the cabin cruiser, but its encircling maneuvers. Side-by-side approach is impossible. The FRC crew gets a vantage point and spots 1, 2, and 3 bodies lying on the deck. This gets the attention of the room as there's now a potential foul play. The higher ranked fellows are about to shoo me out of the room now. The FRC crew somehow manages to get a man on board the rogue vessel. He turns the engine off and gets a head count. There are actually 5 people on board, and all indisposed. They're all free of visible injury and open wounds. He administers first aid and finds all of them responsive. The coxswain, which is what they called the guy who got on board, radios in the whole ship reeks of exhaust. It was carbon monoxide poisoning. A crack had worn out a gasket. It was leaking fumes into the cabin and knocked all of them out one by one. He goes on to explain that his jump bag, or medic kit, has only 1 tank of oxygen and 2 air masks. "I'm going to give the oxygen to the kids," he explains through the comm link. "I need extraction." The FRC crew gets them all off the cabin cruisers, secures it to the back of the Coast Guard ship, and hauls everyone back to the bay. The entire family survived from what I saw, but they were incredibly groggy during the treatment. It's possible they suffered long-term effects. I cannot stress this enough. Check your engines, check your exhaust systems, and check your blowers. I was a first responder for exactly 1 month, as it required experience to be certified in first aid in my country. One of my colleagues told me about the accident that happened the day before that I actually started. He and I both agreed that I was incredibly fortunate not to have to witness such a scene. There was a severe roadway accident around 1 a.m. All they knew going in was there were 3 cars totaled along the side of a forested highway, so I had really no idea what to expect. The accident occurred late, and outside the city are only clues that they have. All signs point to illegal racing or gang violence of some kind. No one is excited to be driving into the rural darkness with potential dangers somewhere nearby. The first vehicle spotted is a convertible with a retractable roof. There are ribbons of bright twisted metal everywhere, and there are no people in the vehicle. They begin scanning the tree line for impacted bodies that have been sent flying from the force of the collision. Then the nightmare begins. Blood paints a scene like it fell from the sky, layered with shattered glass, leather, and fabrics, debris, and eventually, whole body parts. There are feet and hands scattered between other vehicles, amongst the gore and organs. The speed of these vehicles is assumed to be upwards of 200 kilometers per hour. They find their first survivor, a young woman impaled by a tree branch, suspended a full 5 feet in the air. It's through her hip, and causing so much pain that she's in and out of consciousness. This wasn't the worst part though. As they jump out of the ambulance and start setting up for treatment, all they can hear is laughter. The driver of the hardtop car was still seated. The airbag and belt saved him, but he wasn't moving. He was frozen underneath all the debris, which is why no one saw him upon arrival. His hands were on the steering wheel. He's laughing maniacally, tears running off of his face, yelling from time to time, I told her, as people scrambled about him to save lives. Meanwhile, he's basically a victim of the Batman animated series Joker gas. The laugh was out of control. The girl in the tree was one of the very few survivors, only the third out of 12. The impalement didn't severely damage any of her organs, and being biomedic by trade, she kept herself steady enough on her pike not to lose too much blood. Her two friends and the dog in the back didn't. Her fiance, the laughing man, still struggling with PTSD to this day. I worked as a security guard for a large farming facility in the early 2000s. Very few things ever happened at this job, but there was one night that I actually had to call the cops. A series of alarms had been triggered, starting with the outlier fence, the secondary internal fence, and then various warehouse doors. The farm I worked for was specialized, and so made the proper investments in security. Like I said, this was a first for me. I wasn't even sure if the alarms were going off for real. I think it's human nature to assume at face value that there must be a mistake rather than the real crisis. I scan the camera feeds before I do anything, just to see if I can get some kind of confirmation. I don't even look for 30 seconds before I see some weirdo scrambling between the buildings. I hit the call button for the police department, and then call my supervisor and let him know what's going on. "Did you already notify the police?" he asked me. "Yeah," I replied. "Does he look crazy? There's nothing really to steal in there." "Well, we get some wackadoos from time to time," he explained nonchalantly. He goes on to assure me that I'm safe in the guard room and the guy will probably run before the cops can get there. We wrap up the call so I can continue surveillance. Instead of finding his way on the farm grounds, he starts scaling the side of the warehouse. This is when the police show up. They buzz the intercom at the entry gate, which I let them in. But not before I realize I didn't speak to them through the intercom system. This officer is going to have no idea where to begin looking. I've successfully created a situation where I have to leave the safety of the guard room. I gather up what meager equipment I have, like a flashlight and my radio, and shoulder my way out into the darkness. By the time I get down to where the squad car is, the cop has already spotted the perp up on the rooftops. This officer doesn't shout any commands, doesn't declare his rank or police status. He simply climbs the side of the building and starts pumping after this guy, like an Olympic sprinter. It was definitely a sight to behold. It was so inspiring that I started following around on foot from the ground. I kept my flashlight beaded on the suspect so the cop didn't have to use his. He could just focus on charging him down. The suspect books it to the edge of the building, and instead of coming to a complete stop, he hurls himself across the gap and lands on the other side. The gap is a full 8 to 10 feet. I gulp because I know this cop is going to jump after him. "Watch the gap!" I holler up at him, and that's all I can really do. He gains a little extra speed and throws himself the distance, but he sends it too hard. He lands on the other side and disappears through the ceiling like a rabbit in a top hat. With all his muscle and extra gear, he crashed right through and plummeted into our livestock below. Like I said, we were a specialty farm, and our specialty was maggots. Inside this warehouse were massive vats of spoiling meat. Many of them were sealed shut, but some of the vats, in different phases, needed to be exposed to open air. This cop was up to his eyeballs, literally in dead, rotting animals and squirming baby maggots. It took an hour to pull him out, and we never caught that guy that he was chasing. I'm a firefighter, and I don't remember exactly what the call was. It was something minor, but it was the same week that a man in a different state had set fire to his house and then opened fire on the responding firefighters with an AR-15. Every department across the country was on edge that week because no one had ever done anything like that. It was a new tactic on everyone's news channel. All kinds of psychos could now utilize. We suited up and rolled out the engine. The house was just a few streets over, so we were able to avoid main roads, lights, and sirens. Again, everyone is nervous about potentially being ambushed by a lunatic. The engine pulls up on scene and we offload, expecting someone to come out and brief us on whatever is going on. No one appears. One of the crewmen mentions that it looks like the front door is partially open, which is eerie and relieving at the same time. Maybe we're supposed to let ourselves in. Maybe they were expecting to hear the siren. None of us know what to make of it. In my head, I imagine there's someone hiding on the other side of the door with a 12-gauge pump, ready to cut us all in half. A couple of guys step in while the rest of the team waits. The house is dead silent, so they call out, only to get no response. It's freaky quiet for a place they just called the fire department, so we start guessing there's a corpse somewhere in here. The air is stale, the lights and water don't work, and the AC thermostat is out. We all suspect something bad is going on, so quickly, we vacate the premises. Once we step out onto the lawn, one of the crewmen notices the address. The mailbox in front of the house has one number, but the address on the actual home is different. We send a few guys down the lane and sure enough, the emergency is south of us by almost a block. We relocate and begin handling the situation. It's just a fall or something minor like that. A few of the guys ask one of the family members about the house, to which they explain that the house had been vacant for months. To this day, I can't figure out why the number on the mailbox had been changed and why the front door was left open. It was all a very unsettling memory for me. I work in Detroit, and we were driving to a post, and we had a long-distance transport for an hour. The transport duty was take us 4 hours away into another city, where we would briefly work with another team. My partner and I are beyond pumped to make the trip, pretty much just killing time until pickup. We rolled down a side street when we see a kid trying to get our attention. He flags us down and says his brother was shot and needs help. We look to where he's pointing, and sure enough, a 20-something-year-old male is propped up against a wall with blood pouring out of him. When was he shot? I asked. The kid opens his mouth, but something cuts him off. A gunshot cracks through the air, as if in response. Just now, he says. We assess the victim and see 2 wounds in his chest, 1 in his arm. We radio in to dispatch everything we see and ask for instruction. I kid you not, this is the response. 892, this is Detroit. There is no ETA on the squad car. Officers are currently engaged with multiple shooters in your area. Be advised to load and go with any and all victims. We never made it to transport duty. We spent the afternoon loading up the 2 stretchers we had with shooting victims while providing support to on-scene officers engaged in a firefight. One of those funny weekends where Detroit seemed less like a city and more like a war zone. I work overnights in the inner city. Lots of sad, dreary interactions, but less scary than you'd actually think. There was one interaction that we had that scared the sense right out of me and actually lingered in the back of my mind for quite some time. It's what I don't know about the situation that makes me anxious. It's around 2 a.m. when we make a loop under a John Highway overpass. The alleys are typically ripe with hookers, drunks, gangbangers, and drug dealers. It's not a place you want to be sent to as a paramedic, but you never know what you might find. It's the random loops through those no-man lands that usually yield results. It's a lot easier to save someone when the shooting is all over. Sure enough, we spot a man lying face down just outside the glow of a street lamp. We chirp the sirens a few times to see if they stir awake. No movement. I start gloving up and getting all my equipment ready, all while my partner turns on the floodlights and the overhead cherry to allow us to work. The patient is in his mid-20s, scruffy and riddled with gunshot wounds. There's half a clip in his torso, and several more rounds clean through his arms and legs. This guy should not be alive, and whoever was shooting him definitely wanted him dead. Regardless, we were giving the guy treatment and load him onto a stretcher. I see a guy cut around a corner and start approaching us the moment we stand up. With that stretcher, we're totally caught in the open with our hands full, and he gets within 15 feet of us and draws a gun. Probably still hot from shooting the kid lying between us. We stop moving when he points the barrel at my partner. "You're gonna put him back on the ground now, all right?" he says. "Okay." we respond. Now, right now, he encourages. We lay the stretcher down and take a few steps back. He glares at us before pointing at the ambulance with the gun. Get the hell out of here and don't make any calls, he instructs us. We clamber into the car, kill the floods in the Cherry, and cruise back to the residential areas. Just as we were cutting out from the overpass, we hear 2 gun reports and see the flash of a barrel. We radio dispatch our location and request immediate police on the scene. The abrupt change in our code got us a cop there relatively quickly. The shooter finished the job and then disappeared under the highway. No casings, no evidence. We were the only witnesses, but no one ever brought the guy in. The guy is walking the streets still to this day. Let me tell you guys about the worst mistake my partner ever made, one that put me in danger. I only started telling this story recently. The first rule of EMS, at least in my book, is my safety first, my partner's safety second. The patient comes third. This is a word of advice handed down to me from more experienced responders, people that had seen routine calls go fatal over very simple, well-intentioned mistakes. It's wild what just a little human decency can lead to in those situations. The first most basic step for every call is making sure the scene is safe. I'm talking rogue assailants, active shooters, people with knives, gang violence, mental distress in patients, etc. If a scene isn't safe, you stage for police and wait for them to declare the scene safe for EMS arrival. Now, we rolled up on this call. There were no other emergency services around. Several people see us in the ambulance as this kid is telling us what happened. So now with only 2 options, drive down the block, stage for PD to secure the scene, and then come rescue the probably already deceased victim, or jump right into the action, getting the guy while he still has a chance of survival. This would also ensure we didn't look like the asshole ambulance that rolled up on a gunshot and then drove 2 blocks away, parked until the cops arrived. You must keep in mind that Detroit is horribly understaffed with officers, so it could take up to an hour to get anyone on scene. Personally, I have a family to go home to, so I don't care how bad it looks on me or my company. I'm not risking my life. I'm driving away and waiting on the cops, no matter how long it takes. My partner, however, had different plans. She immediately jumps out after hearing what happened and rushed over to the scene to start treatment. Now I'm stuck with a dilemma. Do I save my ass and abandon my partner and patient? Or do I get out and help, since we already made contact, against my wishes nonetheless? I honestly don't know what to do. Part of me was about to slide right over, shift back into drive, and roll down the road and out of sight. I'm watching her work alone in the dark and can't stomach it. Literally anything can happen in this moment, and we haven't even had so much contact from anyone else. I radio dispatch and let them know the situation, request police support and possibly another medical team, park the ambulance and scan for any gunmen, and then hopped out of the car. I was pissed beyond belief. If she wants to put herself in harm's way, not my problem. But when you drag me into the shit show, now we do have a problem. Luckily, and obviously, I didn't die. We got the victim stable and transported back to the hospital. And I heard over the radio that there were 2 more shootings in that area that night. Thank God I wasn't one of them. We get a call at the fire department for a house fire, possible victims trapped inside. We arrive on scene and find a family in distress. One of the kids had been playing with matches unbeknownst to the rest of the family. He was flicking them alight in one of the back rooms of the house, and the curtains caught fire, and the carpet, and the walls, and the furniture. Once the family figured out what happened and why, they started their own quick evacuation, and they got themselves and some select belongings out of the structure. Some of the crew members are talking with the family while we get everything out, which is how we learned of one of the sisters was missing. Neither of the parents did a head count during the initial panic, and they both forgot the middle child was in the house somewhere. We paused the firefighting efforts and let a guy do a quick run through. He finds her in the hallway that connected to most of the bedrooms. She probably saw or smelled the smoke, tried to escape, and was knocked unconscious from those same fumes. It was a good thing she was unconscious. When he laid her down on the cot, some of her exposed skin stuck to the shell of his bunker coat. The heat had blistered her skin just enough to stick on contact with other hot materials. Please, check the batteries in your smoke detectors. We had an officer who had a rover job on midnights. He essentially went from one block to a neighboring block every half hour. We have 8 housing units, 4 blocks, 2 sides. Total symmetry and easy to navigate. Alpha Block 1 and 2, Baker Block 1 and 2. And his job was Alpha Block only. He does a perimeter check at 2 a.m. and makes the rounds. The place is dead silent and sterile as hell. Flickering fluorescent lights, cleaning chemicals, the whole 9 yards. It's hard to explain why correction facilities feel creepy when they're so kempt, but they do. Nothing can dispel the energy of violence, hate, and murder. During the first round there's only one guy out of place, an inmate out of bed, standing at the toilet doing his business. The officer moves on and finishes his duties. Around 4 a.m., he makes his way to A1 and realizes the inmate who'd been using the bathroom 2 hours ago is still in that same position. He called his name, rattled the gate, then called the code after no response. He rushes in and takes a peek at his face, only to find his eyes rolled up so far the eye holes are filled with muscle and flesh. The inmate had hung himself, using a pair of shoelaces tied to the air vent grate above the toilet. He was probably dead the first round, then discovered on the second. The officer was cleared of any dereliction of duty, thankfully. The weirdest part was dealing with the inmates from his block the next day. They were locked down for investigation, but by the evening were cleared to go to rec. They were stunned. The inmate was well-liked, well-mannered, an old Italian guy. His family visited him religiously, and he swooned over his grandkids. But when you decide you're going, you don't advertise it. Our officer was pretty messed up, as you can imagine, committed to having nightmares and anxiety over not being cleared, despite having been cleared. It was hard watching this ball of joy retreat into himself. He's much, much better now, but I'm sure that incident didn't disappear for good from his memory. Mine certainly hasn't. But that's another story for another time. Watch your 6. Get home safe from your fellow sister officer. EMT from Arkansas here. I work a night shift in a rural area, and most of our service area is mountains and forest. One night, we received a 911 call for an older woman who had found her husband apparently dead. In our area, EMS goes to the scene first, as paramedics have protocols that allow them to confirm the death in the field. The location of the call was about 55 minutes deep into the surrounding national forest, which is mostly uninhabited. We follow our GPS until we realize that the GPS no longer shows us on our route. The road that we were on isn't on any of the paper maps. It's not in the GPS, and we can't find it in our phones. We're pretty much in bum Egypt with no GPS, nor can we make contact with dispatch or the sheriff's office on the radio. We decided to go back, but the road is so narrow, the ambulance is scraping against the sides of trees as we try to back up. It's basically just an ATV trail. We spend about half an hour with me backing up, my partner guiding me so I don't hit anything. We finally get to an open area, enough to turn around and start heading back the way we came. As we're driving, I noticed something in the road. I pointed out to my partner as I stop, and the figure moved towards us. It looked like a man dressed in all in black, and we just sit there for half a minute, both of us staring at him, and he staring at us. The whole time we're just saying WTF, WTF. Finally, the figure turns and points down a little side road that we hadn't noticed before because it was so dark and it wasn't on our GPS. We try our radio, but dispatch for police backup and still no signal. So we decide this must be the neighbor trying to help us find the place. We finally go down the road he pointed. I'm hearing banjo music in my head. I'm thinking of how many different ways this could get fucky. I've been on similar calls where we find a crazy person that tries to stab us when we approach, or somebody who is methed out of their mind and wants to kill us and take our narcotics. We eventually roll up to a little trailer. We're now over an hour from the nearest highway. We were later told dispatch was flipping out trying to make contact with us because they couldn't even find our satellite tracker on their map. We slowly approach and go inside. Find an elderly woman sitting on the floor next to a body. The body is the same size and build as the figure that led us to that house. We feel the body. It's in rigor mortis, meaning it's been dead for at least a few hours now. We console the woman for a moment and ask if she has any neighbors. She says the nearest neighbor she has is a house that we passed 7 miles back. We confirm the death and ask the woman if she has a telephone. We use her landline to call the sheriff's office to get the county coroner and officers out to investigate. Once they show up, we ask if they met the man that we met. They told us no. They followed our tire tracks in the mud. My partner and I got the hell out of there. We never talked about it again. And still to this day, I get shivers every single time we go into that forest. This isn't my story, but my brother's. Some things are much scarier than ghosts. My brother is a super cop. He used to work a special unit where he was paired with mental health workers. They would go around busting a special class of crime, which was mostly just responding to stuff like suicide attempts. One time, they get a call about someone seeing ghosts at a haunted abandoned funeral home. They respond. The lady has a history of mental health issues, which is why they were sent. She's reported all sorts of things over the years. Aliens, Bigfoot, neighbors hauling dead bodies around, Major League Baseball spying on her with satellites, and the list just goes on and on. They take her statement in her apartment. She takes them out to her balcony and points over to an actual abandoned funeral home. Sure enough, yes, this place actually exists. She goes on to tell them, the ghosts go out and have a smoke right over there. Points to an area by the doors. They were out when I called you, but then they left. She goes on about how they come all the time and how it's their job to watch her from the funeral home. But like anyone else, they need a smoke break when they aren't working. She's scared they're gonna come for her. Sometimes they point at her. She knows they know she's there. She needs something to be done about the ghosts. So after talking her down, my brother decides they should actually investigate this. They walk over to where the woman had pointed, and amazing enough, there are cigarette butts on the ground. He says he looks up and the woman is out in the balcony, giving them a thumbs up and all smiles. So they take a deep breath and decide to investigate inside. He tries the door and, of course, it's unlocked. But the whole place is in darkness, giving off that whole abandoned building full of death vibe. He does what he's supposed to and calls in for backup. They look around the buildings and no cars. Shining the flashlight in windows, they don't see anyone or anything inside. Finally, backup arrives. It's him and 2 other cops, and this spook psychologist who are going to look for ghosts. He says they go in. As they're walking through the place, it's something like 3 a.m. They start hearing all these weird noises in the pipes. Shadows are jumping out at them, etc. After something like 10 minutes of flashlight spook show, one of them happens to try a light switch, and of course, they find out pretty quickly the power hasn't been shut off in the building, and what they were hearing was the furnace. He gets a bit pissed no one could tell him it had been recently abandoned, and more pissed they didn't just try the lights in the first place. But whatever, creep show averted. They all have a laugh and think it's funny. No one is any longer freaked out. But then, they get to the actual scary part. They completed the search, and they find a bunch of food wrappers and other garbage lying around in one of the rooms. They start to think it's just homeless people crashing the place since it's only recently been abandoned. But then, they start searching more. Find really crude plans describing the people living in the apartment buildings, when they come and go. He said it was basically notes for robbing the crazy woman's building. He said what was even more creepy was within these notes. It stated which people were cute, which people had kids, and what ages. Like he said, it was beyond even what they expect burglars to have. So maybe, the crazy woman was at least partially right. Hey everybody, thanks for listening if you stuck around to this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button, subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email or post it to my subreddit. You can stalk me on Twitter, you can stalk me on Facebook, and you can also stalk me on Instagram. All of these links are below. What's up, YouTubers, YouTube viewers, you guys and gals? What's going on? Lost my train of thought already. Yeah, so 100% from now on, there will be 2 episodes out every single week. I know I've made a lot of promises that I haven't delivered on because my life is kind of chaos at the moment with a lot of shit going on. But yeah, 100% that's happening. Found a really solid dude, does fantastic work and is getting me stories on a regular basis now, and I can take that off of the list of things to do. Yeah, so that'll 100% again be happening from every single week from here on out. The plan is Tuesday, Thursday uploads. This Thursday I won't be uploading because it's Thanksgiving and I know that video will flop, so I'm gonna put it on Friday. But unless it lands on a holiday, you can expect uploads every Tuesday, Thursday. Occasionally that might change, especially if I'm also gonna do another Stories for Sleep episode this week at some point too. So probably have that one out tomorrow, and that one's just going to be the last couple of, months of stories. So look out for both of those. The rest of this week, I can't remember exactly what the topic is for the next episode, but that'll be on Friday. Stories for Sleep most likely will be out tomorrow. So look out for that, and look out for this, and you can get with this, you can get with that. And I think that's it. I don't have anything else to really ramble about. So hope you like this episode. Had a lot of fun making this one. I don't think I've done EMS stories or first responder stories in a long time. So yeah. Hope you all have a fantastic Thanksgiving. If I don't talk to you then, which I probably won't, eat some good food, stuff yourselves full, take a nap on the couch. That's my plan. All right. I love y'all. Cheers.